Okay, folks, I think we'll get started. Good morning. Welcome to all who have joined us this morning for, I think, what will be an informational, educational session on cybersecurity and/or cyber liability insurance. For those folks who don't know me, my name's Brian Hanafy. I am the Chief Revenue Officer for ICS, and for many of the folks on this webinar, we are your managed services provider. Joining me on this webinar this morning are Wes Spencer. Wes is the VP and Channel Chief for Fifth Wall, well known throughout our industry. Reed Wellock, he's the president of Fifth Wall, and they're going to go deep on cyber insurance for us. David D'Agostino, he's the vice president of Integer Cybersecurity. He runs our cybersecurity division. And he's going to talk through some of the current trends and what we're seeing in the marketplace. Our goal here this morning is to go about 45 minutes. I'd ask if you have questions, if you could put those in the chat, and we'll get to a question and answer session at the end, and we promise to get through all of your questions. We appreciate in advance if you'll mute yourself. And with that, I'm going to let David take over. There you go, David.
Thanks, Brian. Oh, there we go. Sorry. This morning, I wanted to start off talking about the current threat landscape. As you can see here in the slide, the cybersecurity attacks are certainly on the rise. And one of the primary drivers to that is the phishing attempts. And that's one of the most common methods that threat actors are using to gain access or credentials to companies. As you can see here, more than 80% of reported security incidents are phishing related. You've probably yourself seen or at least one phishing email, something that is asking for a password reset or your credentials or to click on the status of a package. You or your employees certainly are seeing that. And in the news, we hear about these zero-day threats or attacks, vulnerabilities discovered in software services. Security is and always will be a moving target, and it's important to keep up with current and best practices to defend your organization. Three of the most common trends that we're seeing in the ransomware space is the supply chain attacks or third-party attacks. This is essentially when organizations have some level of access to your organization. It could be a software provider. It could be an HVAC vendor. That was the case within that large Target breach from several years ago. But basically, understanding that relationship and access, monitoring that access is key, because oftentimes we're seeing organizations breached secondarily from a primary organization and then gaining access throughout that access through that same third-party relationship. There's these ransomware as a service organizations out there, which are essentially businesses set up by criminals for criminals, and it's enterprise level at this point. There's marketing, there's headhunters, there's a help desk, there's a customer service line, and they essentially are driving the IT requirements or the cyber requirements to deliver this malicious software or gain access to these organizations. And so these non-technical malicious actors who want to get in the ransomware business because it's so lucrative are outsourcing these services, and it's basically naming their targets. And so that's driving this increase, and then also the increase in that size of that ransomware and activity. And now we're seeing these newer types of methodologies that are being used called multi-extortion or double extortion techniques. And that's essentially when someone gains initial access and then they start to move laterally throughout the organization in the organization with access, looking for key information, key data, client information, sensitive data, regulated information if you're in the healthcare or financial space. And then they exfiltrate that information into their server environment or some cloud-based server environment. And then they will do that encryption piece. And then they use that as an extortion method, as a way to gain leverage and continue to ask for that higher ransom. And if they don't get it, then they start to threaten to leak that information out either on the dark web, into social media, into news outlets, or even we've seen them going as far as contacting clients or employees to let them know that the company has been breached and their information has been leaked, and to put pressure on the organization to pay these ransom amounts. next slide here. I feel like there's a delay. Okay, and so this is the average ransomware demand that we're seeing in the industry and across the industry here. And as you can see, it ranges between like 600,000 to almost $8 million. This is the initial amount demanded once an organization is impacted. And one of the statistics here on the right is from one of the most notorious ransomware groups out there called REvil. And in 2020, their average initial ransom amount was just under 500,000. And today, we're seeing it, or actually not even today, it's even higher today, but this was as of 2021, it was 2.2 million. It's significantly higher even today. And so, you know, all this activity obviously equates to big business and often funded by, these payouts are typically funded by cyber insurance policies, which we'll talk a little bit more about here. So there's this myth that you'll know instantly if your device is infected. And unfortunately, the fact of that is typically we don't know right away. This is because of these new methods. Oops, sorry. Animation. There we go. Typically nothing happens at first, like we talked about these multi-extortion techniques. Basically, you know, at the end of the day, organizations, when it comes to cybersecurity, they're looking to protect their data, their property, their reputation, their clients' information from these bad actors who are trying to gain access for financial gain. And so it's not necessarily one person, it could be a group, it could be an organization, it could be it could be another country in some instances if you're in a high targeted area like financial services, utilities, education, healthcare. We're seeing attacked from all over the world and sometimes these nation states. And so what that delay in knowing allows us to do is that delay from when someone gains access and a foothold into your network and actually starts to encrypt your organization is called the dwell time. And we're seeing that increase with these multi-extortion tactics, which does buy time. If you have the proper methods in place and you're practicing, you know, best practices in hygiene, regularly updating your system, reviewing, inspecting, and having monitoring in real time so that you can determine if these, what we refer to indicators of compromise exist in your environment. And then based off of those, there's methods of incident response to remediate these things before they become a fully encrypted organization or infrastructure or exfiltration of data, because there's usually steps and methods taken. And if you can stop them earlier on in what's referred to as the kill chain or the MITRE attack, these different methods that actors use, we align to those to find these things. And so it's important to have that good hygiene and then continued best practices. We refer to those best practices internally here as our defense in depth top 10. And we start with basic hygiene, with, you know, basic backup business continuity, enhanced detection and response, multi-factor authentication, end user awareness training that emulates these phishing techniques and tactics so that your end users and what we refer to as that human firewall and last layer of defense is better protected. And then ongoing vulnerability management so that when there's these new 0-day or new exploits and vulnerabilities that exist, you're aware of them sooner so that you can remediate them and close up those potential open doors and windows. These 5 are now becoming standard for organizations to renew or to get new cyber liability insurance policies. These were not requirements even 6 to 12 months ago, but we're seeing that today. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But these are basic hygiene requirements now. And as we continue on down that defense in depth, we can see that we had extended detection and response and SIM, which is essentially a holistic view of your organization and infrastructure. Brian, I'm having a hard time moving it through here. I'm just going to try to go right through it because it's like a delay. Okay. So we go to this extended detection and response view, active threat detection and monitoring. So that tool looks at your entire infrastructure and environment, and then it identifies these indicators of compromise because it has a full view of the cloud and the firewall and all the endpoints. It looks for these indicators of compromise. And then through that detection, an incident is developed and reviewed and managed, and there's determined processes and methodologies so that there's a faster time to detect and respond to these types of activities. And then an ongoing risk assessment, which is aligned into like a cybersecurity framework organizations at the highest level, the board level, they need to understand the risk and the likelihood and the impact of these types of activities happening so that they can determine their appetite for risk and whether they assign a budget to mitigate that risk or they own that risk. But oftentimes we go into organizations that were impacted and they didn't know that could have happened to them, or they didn't think they were under attack. And clearly understanding the risk will help organizations balance and create their understanding of that and where they stand, and so that they're aware and they can make sounder business decisions. And then again, we don't believe in just tools alone that can provide these level of insight and vision. It really takes a team of experts to review and validate and even act in the manner of a malicious actor to test out these policies and procedures and your ability to detect them and respond to them. So we run through tabletops. We do red teaming, which is essentially acting like a bad guy trying to gain access or gain passwords by cracking them, and then showing the organizations we work with to strengthen those things, like a fire drill. Slide. So we often recommend aligning to a cyber security framework. We use either the NIST CSF or the CIS critical controls. The reason why we recommend this is because it's a really cost-effective way for organizations to approach cybersecurity and foster an environment with conversation around risk and compliance. And so we kind of break it up into these 5 categories of identifying what you have, understanding that if you can't see it and you don't know it exists, you really can't protect it. And then we work through the protection method. Oh, it changed by itself. Oh, sorry. Then we go to detection and response and recovery. And aligning to that framework just helps create a full understanding of where you stand. You really get to see like how well you're doing in these different 5 categories. Oftentimes, organizations do a really good job of identifying and protecting. Detecting is okay, and then their respond and recovery is kind of slow. Respond is usually the big one. Recovery is a little bit better because they have methodologies in place around business continuity and disaster recovery. And all of these bullet points that you see are just recommendations that we make to help improve and harden your infrastructure and your organization. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to the cybersecurity and cyber insurance experts.
Fantastic. David, thanks. That's super awesome. And from our side of the house, you nailed it. Absolutely love your approach. I love the controls that you guys put in place in your approach to security. Really, really, really solid. So you've got Wes Spencer and Reed Wellock on. Reed's our president. Reed, you want to say hi and do the disclaimer that we always have to give?
Yeah. Well, good morning, everyone. We are, first of all, before I get into disclaimer, let me just tell a little bit about Fifth Wall, who we are, and why we're qualified to talk about this topic, which is cyber insurance. So we are based in Pittsburgh, and we're the first wholesaler, which is really an entity where retail agents across the country access to focus on cyber insurance exclusively. We've been doing this for over 6 years. So we work with every single carrier and market out there today. So we're really familiar with their process, what they're asking, what they're looking for, and we're really familiar with how this evolved, which is the story we're going to tell. So part of that story, we're going to be using examples in this presentation. And so that is part of the disclaimer, is that these, you always want to look and refer to a actual policy for terms and conditions, limitations, and exclusion in the event of a loss. So that's just the legalese that I need to speak before we jump into this. Now, should I be requesting control here? Okay, we'll just move through. So Wes and I have done this many times before, and what we realized is, I've been talking about cyber insurance for over 6 years, which is a long time to be talking about something that's typically not that exciting. But still, we see there's varying levels of understanding and awareness to the issue and the problem, right? Which is okay, because I feel like there's a lot of folks that have had different types of life experiences around security issues and with insurance. And let's be candid, this is something very new for our industry. So if you have a retail agent in your life and you've been talking about cyber insurance, you could be dealing with someone that is an expert and knows everything about different types of liability, workman's comp, but cyber's new. It's this different kind of animal. So we always like to kick it off with some scenarios and examples just to kind of get folks into the right mode of thinking that there's many different ways that businesses can be affected. And when you think about this, and you could read through these, but a lot of what we're seeing, and David already alluded to this, is there's a reality that data is important. People are going to want what you have, but don't look just at what you have to understand what your exposure looks like. Many times it's simply about access, using you, manipulating you to get to something else or to get to someone else. So that's a big takeaway I want to make sure folks are thinking through when they're thinking about their business, and, you know, doing your own little tabletop exercise to understand what does the exposure look like. Look at it in that way, because the claims we're seeing they vary, but a lot of them really are getting to the point where it's not first party in our world, it's third party, it's others. So and I know, Wes, you have a long history in the security world, and particularly in the banking world. You've had a few of these actual scenarios. You've seen them firsthand, right?
Yeah, sure have. You know, one of the things that I've had in my career in cybersecurity is working with a lot of organizations that have gone through a breach. And I can share with you story after story, but you know, one of the things that rings true oftentimes is, you know, a lot of many small and mid-sized businesses don't realize that there's such a threat. And that's one of the most dangerous pieces, right? If I'm let's just use an analogy here. If I'm a bank robber, am I going to go after Bank of America's headquarters in like downtown New York or wherever it is? Or am I going to go after a small rural bank? I'm going to go after the small bank every single time. Now, yes, the payouts are much lower, but the chance of success is far, far higher. And this is exactly what these threat actors have seen. They've discovered, whoa, I can go after a small business that doesn't have the resources of Bank of America, and I can still command significant damages and payout. So you can see these examples here. You see this first example. These are actual real examples. And these are examples that insurance covers, which is really important, right? So this first one, you accidentally transmit, we call this the insurance world a virus, but you know, it's usually ransomware. It's things that lead to like the nasty outputs. And total losses are $3 million. And you might think, how in the world could it possibly be $3 million? Well, we'll talk about some examples of this, but just to tease it for you, it's not just paying a ransom. Think about business outages. You know, the average ransomware attack is about 16 days of total outage time, let alone trickles of things getting back online over the next few months. So just take your annual, your average monthly revenue and just slash it in half. Good way to think about it, right? But then you also have lawsuits and reputational damage and client monitoring, all these other kinds of things, right? And you see the second example where, you know, we get some kind of email that comes in. We thought it was legitimate. We thought it was from a proper vendor in place. And unfortunately, what did we do? We just sent it off to the nether. We got this like payment invoice that came in, and we thought it was legitimate. So we paid it. And then, you know, a week or a few days later, the vendor comes back and says, you haven't paid us. And you're thinking, yeah, I did. Here's the evidence. They say that email was not from us. You got a phishing email and wired the funds incorrectly. So these things are big, right? Reputational damage. This is a big one that you see here on the screen. One of the things that I have seen in my experience is when clients go through a breach, somewhere around 30% of their entire client book goes away. I was talking to a client up in New York City, good friend of mine actually, who went through a very significant breach. And I was talking to him about a month ago, and I said, hey, how are things going for you guys in your recovery? He's fully up online. All his clients have been recovered from this nasty ransomware that he went through. He said, Wes, I lost about 30% of my business. And he goes, that's just what I've had right now. He goes, I'm probably going to lose more over time too. And he said the most damaging one, he said, a good friend of mine that I did a lot of business with fired me. And when he called me to fire me, he said, hey, this is not my decision. I don't want to be the one firing you, but my clients are forcing me to fire you because when you guys had the outages, it caused my business to be interrupted with my clients. And one of them, my largest supplier, said, you're not doing business with that guy anymore. So these things happen. And I'm not saying this to scare you. I'm saying this because it's real. There's a reality here. And what we're talking about is business risk. I think one of the most important things that we can talk about is risk to your business. This is the kind of thing you think about every single day, and cyber risk has become such a big deal. Reed, you want to talk about this right here and this tactic shift from technical over into human error?
Yeah, and I think this is where I hope folks understand that this is not it gets complicated, but it's actually not that complicated on how it starts. Because, and I'm speaking from the insurance world, right? I'm looking at data based off of businesses that have already been impacted and gone through that that heartache of what you just described, Wes, and the data showing us is pretty compelling. It's a lot easier to trick somebody. It's a lot easier to manipulate a human being to get someone to do something on your behalf than to actually put forth the effort to do it yourself. That's just a reality. And we're seeing that time and time again. The tactics are pretty basic. And what you're saying is hacking, and putting that in air quotes. It really is just human manipulation, right? And this category falls into, you want to make sure, because human error is also qualified by simply not doing certain things or disabling certain things from a technical perspective. Yes, you could call that technical failure, but it was a human element that was to do something that wasn't done. And so aligning yourself with someone that actually understands that is really important from a security posture standpoint. So that's just the cautionary tale, is to understand you really want to make sure you're aligning yourself with someone that is very security focused. They can put those technical elements in place and manage them properly. And then, as David alluded on the previous slide, there's different ways that you can educate your team. And you really want to make sure that there is I call it just a baseline of awareness. Folks don't need to understand the ins and outs, but they do need to understand what good hygiene looks like, because that's what we're seeing. Very simple mistakes lead to catastrophe. All right, we can go to the next slide. So real quick, I like to tell this story, and I will keep it brief, but for those of you that are on this call, you're on a call trying to learn a little bit about cyber insurance, which is not the most exciting thing, but I know this has been a forced issue because, we're seeing it based off of what we're seeing from a volume standpoint, but this game has changed and it's hitting a lot of folks in the equation. So how did we get here? Well, cyber insurance was not always complicated. In fact, it was the opposite. It was really easy. It was way too easy, right? If you had a pulse, and you could showcase that your business had a revenue stream, you could get a cyber policy. And so what happened, long story short, you got a lot of carriers that said, hey, we can sell something, right? Let's go sell something, and we're going to distribute it out as much as possible. And then guess what happened? The inevitable happened, and we saw losses come in. Ransomware came into play. Claims started rising significantly. And in my world, carriers really had two options. Either they backed out completely and said, you know what, too rich for my blood, I'm losing too much money, or they had to completely redo their process. And that's what happened for most. And in that redoing, we saw a lot of the underwriting change. And we're going to get into that, which directly affects your security posture and what carriers are now looking for. So if carriers are now better understanding, because they had to touch the stove to know it was hot. So now that they're really looking at this closely, if you're looking at what they're asking for, it's coming from a pretty consistent place, almost like an unbiased place. This is not someone to say, you need to throw every single security tool at this to stop it, but they are saying there are core table stake controls here that now underwriters are looking for. So it's really good information that we want to make sure is coming across, because it's been a forced issue for all parties to look at this more closely. And what's happened too is that the process has gotten more complicated, but what you're seeing is the insurance side, which has always been slightly behind because they're an actuarial science, they're always looking at the past, they're starting to catch up slowly but surely. So you're seeing this right here. You're seeing security companies, you're seeing MSP companies, you're seeing that alignment with insurance, because now we're telling the same story. And when we're talking about coverage, right? So when we're talking about getting the right coverage, a big thing that I want to make sure is known is that not all coverage is treated is the same, right? And this is part of the due diligence that we do on a daily basis, where we're just trying to help folks understand what they have and what they don't have, right? So we want to say what's needed. We want to say what's good. We want to showcase that. But in insurance, there is getting your own cyber policy. So having a conversation with an agent, having that constructive conversation, walking through the coverages, and making the investment. There's also something that lives out there in the ether called these endorsements. And if you're not working with the right agent, they actually might say that you have cyber coverage, and this might be what they're referring to. And if that's the case, then you're in a very dangerous situation. The reason for that is that it has the word cyber attached to it, but it really is not good coverage. It's an extremely low limit, and it's riddled with exclusions. And I have seen this time and time again, where a business who thought they had good cyber coverage ended up only having, 5-10% of the claim actually covered. The rest that was coming out of their pocket. So working with someone and actually going through the due diligence of just saying, hey, can you tell me what I have? And making sure you're working with someone that actually knows those answers is really, really important.
Yep. And one
Next
thing
slide.
I wanted to add to that, Reed, is just keep in mind, if this intimidates you, that's okay. Don't feel like you have to be the expert here. It's what we do at Fifth Wall, right? Like, we're used to working with, you name the carrier, we know them, we talk to them, we have relationships with them, and we understand this, right? So I think the biggest thing we're trying to convey is, if you don't know where you stand, it's time to understand that, right? It's time to get that understanding. So that's where you want to open that conversation. Yeah. And Reed, if you don't mind, I'll just talk about the crisis management piece here.
Please do.
This is another important piece, is let's talk about what happens after the breach, right? Unfortunately, it's not like, I don't know if you guys saw that movie, The Net, with Sandra Bullock, like way back in the 90s, but like she uploads the virus and then basically, the movie ends and that's the end of the story. Unfortunately, you heard David really talking in depth about, all the controls that you put in place to reduce the chance of that happening, but eventually it does, as he says. And we live in this era of what we call assume breach. And what we mean by that is it's going to happen. It's not a question of if an organization is going to get hit by something. It's a question of when. You even hear the federal government talk about these things of, when a dedicated threat actor, one that's very sophisticated, operating in countries where the U.S. has no extradition, when they focus on something, they'll eventually get in. And that's the sad truth. And so here's what happens after that big boom happens, after the incident happens, right? So a breach occurs. And one of the most important things that you can do is reach out to legal counsel. And the reason for this is because legal, it's going to give you a client attorney privilege. But also, one of the things that's critical through crisis management service with your insurance is that you're not just talking to your local attorney. Local attorneys are fantastic for like business advice and all these kinds of things. But when it comes to cyber is such a huge beast because you have all these new state data privacy laws that have come out. Almost every state has now enacted them. You have all of these issues around what you can and cannot say around liability, because now we're talking actual legal stuff that's happened. Law enforcement many times will get involved. This becomes a big, big deal. And so one of the great things is that on the insurance side, we call these breach coaches, and the carriers actually have these assigned breach coaches, and they'll come in and act on your behalf, and they understand this world. I kind of look at them like quarterbacks. They're really the barking orders. We're going to do this. You're not going to do that. You're going to do this. You're not going to say that. And trust me, in the middle of a breach, when everything just, goes loose, this is vital. So then one of the next things that will happen is forensics kicks in. And you've seen and heard about forensics, right? This is where we actually dive in. We understand the nature of what happened. And one of the reasons for this is you have skilled, trained technicians that are brought in by the carrier. And these folks are responsible for saying, how did it happen? Where did it happen? When did it happen? What's the severity and the extent and scope? And the reason for that is because they're required by federal law, and you are required by federal law to notify every single affected person. And this is where it gets really nasty, right? And so this is where the controls that we have in place through ICS are critical, because they're going to, the forensics team is going to dive in and they're going to take a look at that. And this is where I love the fact that ICS is already positioned for this. Some IT providers that we work with don't have these things in place. And after the big nasty thing happens, you're up a creek without a paddle. And so ICS is doing all the right things in place to reduce that from happening. But in the reality, when something does happen, we have to be ready. We have to have the data. And so that's where this comes in. And then you see all these other things that happen in concert right after this. Notification to clients. Here's what happened. Here's what was affected. Here's what we're doing about it. All of that is important, and the communication of that needs to come in a very clear, concise way where we're saying the right things and not saying the wrong things. And so that's where your legal counsel jumps in and helps you. The public relations piece. Sometimes these things blow up and you see them in the news. Credit monitoring and paying for these kinds of things come in place. And fraud response, right? Actually handle the response to all this. Sometimes that includes paying a ransom. Sometimes that includes getting with banks and trying to recover money. There's a lot of things that happen in the middle and the aftermath of a breach where everything is smoking, and you really got to jump into action. And so these are the things from a crisis management perspective that can really save your bacon. These are the things that when they're in place and the insurance carriers know exactly how to handle this. They're doing it for their benefit and yours. You're mutually aligned on this because they want to reduce the costs that they have to pay out, and you want to reduce your damages and get back to business as quick as possible. Reed, did I miss anything on all that?
No, it's reminding me, working with a client once and went through this whole conversation, right? And what was funny was the business owner said, okay, so I understand there's a lot of financial implications here, and this sounds like it could get really expensive. Okay, I get why insurance is important then. Okay, and he's assuming the when, not if, right? But then his comment was, you know what's really valuable here is this sounds like an insanely stressful time, and a policy is actually going to tell me what to do after this, right? It's going to hold my hand or hold the business's hand and guide them through. Okay, that's worth it right there. Which I thought was really astute, because that is something that we hear all the time, is that a lot of folks, they can prepare, but unless you've been through this, it is not only high stress, but there is time is money. It really is. And so being on a path that's actually planned out and working with someone that has done this time and time again is really, really important. Which I think leads us into getting more into some of the policy itself, which I want to save time here for the end for questions and hit on the main controls. But one thing here is, I don't want to get on an insurance nerd soapbox here and go through all these coverages, because then everyone would fall asleep. But the one thing I do want to make sure everyone understands is that these are really comprehensive. And what I mean by that is that there is some stigma on insurance, and I totally get it. Okay, is this actually going to do what it says it's going to do? Right? Is there some sort of secret trap door here where I'm not going to actually get what I think I'm going to get? The reality is, if you take the time and go through and get a fully comprehensive policy, A to Z, it's covering you, right? To not only go through the event, but to go through the restoration process as well. And some things I just like to highlight for folks whenever you think about this. Wes already hit on it earlier. Think about the fact there's all these other services. There's all these third parties going to come in, okay? And there's this circus. And while that's happening, whether it's a full-fledged ransomware event and you are completely locked out, or maybe it's simply a business email compromise, the end result is still you are disrupted from your business. You are not able to do what you normally are doing on a day-to-day basis, and you're losing revenue. And a really important coverage is that business interruption, right? Because that is quantifiable. And the same goes with reputational damage. That is quantifiable too. So these are elements, they're not hard costs, they're soft costs, but they're really, really important. So, taking the time, and like I said, we're not going to go through all the details here, but taking the time and going through these, this would take me 15, 20 minutes max. Sitting down with you, sitting down with whomever, CFO, business owner, whoever it may be, and just hitting these one by one. And what that does, it's a really good exercise because it paints the picture for you to start to see how, not just what's covered, but how a business can be impacted. It tells a really, really good story. So this is a really important piece, and it's kind of redundant, right? Because it was mentioned earlier, but it's really important to be hit twice, because this is where on our side of the fence, we are hitting time and time again with friction, because to David's point, 12 months ago, insurance was not really looking for specifics, which is crazy, right? They weren't looking for specific types of core controls around security to understand if you're a good risk, if you're worth insuring, or if you're a bad risk, if you're too high of risk and not worth insuring. So what we had in our industry suddenly was almost, I can't say standardized because cyber insurance is not, it's all over the place still, but this is remaining true for most markets today. They're looking for the table stakes, right? And they're saying, all right, we've identified what good looks like to a degree, because these are pretty universal. So, and the nice thing is working with someone like ICS is these are right there. They're right at your fingertips. But understanding what these are, even at a high level, Wes, do you mind just quickly? I know we've only got 9 minutes left here. Just hitting these real quick so folks understand what these are.
Watch me do this in 15 seconds per control. So multi-factor is where you get a code that comes in when you log into something. It's one of the most important pieces. If you don't have multi-factor rolled out everywhere for all of your users, you will not be able to get cyber insurance coverage. It's just that important. And the good thing is, in this day and age, it's not as cumbersome as you might think. It's not, you don't have to pull out your phone and get that code every login. Most of the time it's anomalous. You log in from a new location because you just flew somewhere, a new computer, but it's not every single login. but it is critical. Security awareness training, you already know what this is, right? Where we're teaching you why security matters, what a good password looks like, and these kinds of things, how to spot a phishing email. These are things that we can do to strengthen the human. And as David mentioned, that human firewall, make them the center point of saying, hey, I saw something, I'm going to report this thing, and I'm not going to fall for it. Segregated backups. This is where one of the first things a bad guy does when they get access to your network before they run ransomware is they try to delete your backups. And the reason they do that is if they kill your backups, you're paying the ransom, period, end of story. And so we want to see that you have these segregated backups where they actually, we call them sort of immutable is a word we use. Basically what we mean by that is once a backup's been made, it can't be changed. I can't change it, ICS can't change it, and a threat actor sure cannot change it. So it's really important so we have the ability to get some of that data back. Patching and vulnerability scanning, very simple stuff, right? What we're doing is we're constantly looking to say what is in the network that might need a patch. In other words, as things grow older, we find problems and vulnerabilities in code that we need to install something to update it, or maybe course correct something and change something. Many of these happen all the time. It's just like going to the dentist, right? I go into the dentist every cadence. They might spot a new weakness on that tooth and they're going to patch it up and take care of it before a root canal happens. Same kind of thing. And then next gen antivirus and endpoint detection and response. Sometimes you also see it called XDR as well, like extended detection response. What we're talking about here is think about this as like a home alarm system in your network, right? So, you see, for example, some strange behavior. The hallway monitor trips off at 2 a.m. as a window opens. Wow, that's a sign. Maybe you just forgot your keys and you're coming in late, right? But maybe it's a bad guy in the home. And this is where we're looking at it. We're taking action, calling the police. Same thing on your network. That's what all this is we're watching over, looking for anomalous behaviors, things that seem out of normal on the computer, and we take action on it and we research and dive into it before something really bad happens. So those are the 5 controls that you need to have in place. And unfortunately, what we're seeing happen is you see on this slide right here is this real big challenge around the insurance carriers are starting to wake up to all of this. And they're starting to realize, sometimes what happens is you get these big, long questionnaires and clients are like, I don't really know. Like, I think we're doing that. We'll just put sure. Yes, we're doing that without knowing that you're doing it. And there's an active lawsuit right now by Travelers, one of the largest cyber insurance carriers right now. They're actually suing one of their insureds. And the reason is because in the aftermath, the client had said that they had multi-factor. Remember the codes on the rolled out, you get the code and you try to log in. They didn't have it rolled out. And the source of the breach came from a user who did not have multi-factor enabled. And had they had multi-factor, the forensics showed that it would have stopped the beginning of that attack. And so they're coming after that, trying to pull back the damages that they paid out. Now, we don't know what's going to happen in the aftermath of the lawsuit, but this is the very first time we've seen a cyber insurance carrier come after a client for what we call misrepresenting. And so what's important about this is, and the takeaway for this is, 1, understand what your policy says, and 2, talk to ICS. Make sure that you are aligned with them on the technology that's required. These are the things you have to have in place. Are we actually doing that? Because if we're not, we need to start investing in that, right? That's your job to make sure, because we're seeing this change in where the carriers are coming from. Bunch of takeaways on here. Reed, I'm going to let you take most of these if you want to.
Yeah, I think if anything, we're not trying to scare everyone, but the reality is the story we have to tell is kind of scary. But this is not only on the rise, but it is something that every single business, everyone needs to be cognizant of and paying attention to. I know, given what I do and my passion on insurance, I'm biased here, but here's the reality is that this is a when, not an if. And, there's a safety net that is required to be able to navigate these waters successfully to keep your business afloat. And those waters, they're different. And you want to make sure that safety net has been reviewed. So that's part of the takeaways here that we want to make sure everyone understands is this partnership that we have. It really is comprehensive because you're not only able to have the solutions that insurance is looking for at your fingertips, but we can come in and do that evaluation and help you understand what are the facts, what's real, what's present, what's not present, and maybe some things that we need to look to improve. And that process right now with underwriters, as I described, insurance is getting more chaotic. It's taking more time. And I'm gonna be really candid. This conversation really needs to be at the top of everyone's priority list, and it needs to be started early, because it can take time. If for some reason you don't have the controls that insurance is looking for, some of those controls may take some time to roll out. And this is an evolving process, okay? Insurance is still learning. I'll be transparent about that. So when we mention these 5 core controls, we may be talking again in 6 months, and there may be 7, there may be 9. All right. So you want to make sure you're in tune with partners that are keeping their ear to the ground. And this is serious. As Wes mentioned, that travelers rescinding a policy is something that when you do that, it is out in the open. It is not coming back. So the fact that carriers are really leaning in on this and they're willing to go as far as travelers did means that this is serious, and you really want to be paying close attention. All right. So
Reed, one question that came in from Alicia. What's the average cost of an annual policy for a company, maybe smaller than 30 employees? It's a manufacturer that sells into all other industries. I know it's hard to, but ballparks.
Yeah, so right now, here's the facts I can give you without knowing more specifics. I can't say, oh, it's probably going to be between this range and this range, but minimum premiums right now for cyber insurance policies are ranging between $3,000 to $4,000. Okay, now that's going to go up based off of size. So in manufacturing right now, unfortunately, you're in kind of a little bit of a hot suit because that industry is become higher risk because manufacturing has just been targeted a lot lately. And so I think we could provide that answer probably within a 5-minute conversation as a sidebar, if that's something you would want to talk through. I think budgeting, certainly less than probably 10,000. But that's something it's an easy answer we can come to just with a few bits of information.
What are the highest risk industries? You mentioned manufacturing. What else, Reed, are high risk industries from an insurance perspective?
There's a couple different industries that aren't necessarily because they're high risk, but they've been underserved. So education right now is high risk from an insurance perspective because budgets have not always gone towards the security, right? And manufacturing has become high risk because as an industry, manufacturing didn't look at themselves as being a target, and therefore, to your earlier point, much easier targets, and that escalated quickly. We're also seeing a lot with professional services, right? And the reason for that is access to not only good data that you have, but then easy access to others from a trusted source. So lawyers, CPAs, those that have a high level of influence with their clients, it's really good manipulation, right? And it's really good access. So those are probably some of the heavy hitters we've been seeing lately.
Another good question that came in, and David, if you can come off mute and answer part of this too, but I'll say on the front end, the question is like, what service or solution do you recommend for vulnerability scanning? On the insurance side, the good news is we don't really care. We're not going to specify particular vendors. What we want to see is, do you have a policy in place that shows you're committed to updating them, right? So if you have an employee, it's like, I hate that my computer restarted at 10 p.m. last night and I had to reload it. We just need to make sure we have a policy in place that says you care about it. And yeah, that may kind of stink for you a little bit, but it's too important not to, and that you're actually remediating them. But as far as the controls, like David, you want to talk about what you guys do for that?
Sure. And it's not just the scanning, like we've moved into what we're referring to as vulnerability management, right? And so we like to look at continuous scanning now. I know like a few years ago, even a year ago, some organizations were recommending like a monthly scan, and we scan typically weekly on the external and sometimes as much as daily on the endpoints and on the network because of all these continuous vulnerabilities that are actively being exploited now within 15 minutes we're seeing in some of the latest studies. And so it's really important to manage that risk and understand it and then implement the patching. A number of great tools out there. We use a tool called CyberCNS as part of our offering. Tenable, Qualys, Rapid7 are all great. It's more about how often you're scanning and how effectively you can implement the patching. And that's that second piece of that from a vulnerability management standpoint. That's really where the rubber meets the road.
Nailed it. So Reed, one of the takeaways we want to make sure everyone knew is the ability if they want to, here we go. You want to talk about this, Reed?
Yeah, it is something that is really basic and really easy to take advantage of. So I'd really encourage folks not only take advantage of it, ask yourself why you wouldn't, because it's an important exercise. Essentially, if Fifth Wall can get a copy of your deck page and policy, we will comb through that for you. We'll do a full assessment, and we will break that down based off of what we're seeing in the industry. Okay, so you can actually benchmark where you are today. And then part of that exercise is then a conversation that we're happy to lead with anyone on your side, just to kind of open up the dialogue, answer any questions, but really go through it to help you understand. the facts around this. And this is something that we have been doing for a very long time, and we have done it thousands upon thousands of times. So our staff's very knowledgeable, and then having a partnership with ICS allows us to then also have a conversation if we're looking at improving security posture, right? And we're looking to say, hey, okay, how do I get, maybe you're not eligible this year for a policy. Okay, that should tell you something. Or maybe we can look at this and say, we could probably get you a much better rate, right? If these controls were in place. It's a conversation that you want to make sure you're looking at those facts and just kind of understanding your options. So it's really easy to take advantage of that, just reaching out to us directly. And we're happy to lead that exercise.
Yeah, contact your ICS or Integer salesperson. I want to thank you all for joining on behalf of ICS and Integer. Thank you, Reed and Wes. This was great information. We're going to record this and send this out so that if you have a peer or someone in the organization that wants to see it, we'll send that out. And if you have any other questions, please do not hesitate to contact us. We want to thank you all for joining. We appreciate the opportunity to work with you. Thank you.